I thought it would be interesting to talk about the conference that I co-founded and helped organize, which is called Bang Bang Con. And in honor of that, I'm wearing my Bang Bang Con shirt today.
Cool. So this, for people who haven't seen this, this is 2 exclamation marks, right?
Yes. Yeah. So the conference actually got its name as a result of a conversation involving somebody else who has appeared on this podcast, Julia Evans. I'm trying to think back exactly what the history was. And this is all documented, but this is what I can reconstruct of it right now is, so as you know, so both of us have done residencies at the Recurse Center, and at RC they have a chat service called Zulip, and Zulip, fosters all kinds of conversations. And at one point, people were discussing. There was somebody, Ian, who was a former recurser, who was kind of lamenting the fact that he didn't have a good reason to come back to New York to visit the Recurse Center. And somebody suggested that he should make up a fake conference and submit a talk to it, pretend to accept his own talk, and then have a reason to go. And then, other people kind of, began riffing on this idea, and somehow this idea of a fake conference turned into an idea for a real conference. And somebody suggested that it be called Julia Evans Blog Posts Con, named after Julia's extremely enthusiastic blog. And then this became abbreviated to simply Bang 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 Con, and then later Bang Bang Con.
Wait, how did it go from Julia Evans blog to? Oh, because of the excitement.
I think Julia may have made that suggestion. I don't remember exactly who suggested it, but yeah, it was like the reason for suggesting Julia's blog was because we wanted this conference to be like the conference, like essentially Julia's blog in conference form, capture all of the enthusiasm and kind of unbridled excitement that her blog is about, and what would it be like if there were a conference like that. And so that was the original motivation.
I had no idea. I mean, I knew about Bang Bang Con just very, from an outsider's perspective on social media and stuff, but I actually had no idea how that's actually related to Julia's blog. It's funny because on her podcast, we didn't actually talk about her blog at all.
Sure. Well, it's kind of evolved since then. And Julia was one of the organizers of it the first 2 years. She stepped down this last year, and so and some other people came on board. But I think so. I actually feel a little bit weird sometimes, telling people that this is a conference all about enthusiasm and excitement, because I personally am a pretty curmudgeonly person, actually, and
irony con. So there's an irony conference,
right? Yeah, and there's like fail con, and the thing is that at Bang Bang Con, it's actually not all joy and happiness and roses and sunshine. There are kind of a lot of heavier and more serious topics discussed as well. And I like my kind of current, my favorite, best summary of what Bang Bang Con is about actually comes from somebody who has spoken at 2 Bang Bang Cons so far, Mark Wunsch, who spoke at the first one in 2014, and then at the third one this year. And he described it as a conference that's about experiencing computing viscerally. And I like that a lot because for me that captures what makes Bang Bang Con unique. We had talks this year that made people laugh, that made people cry, that made people scream, holy shit. And this doesn't necessarily happen at the average conference. In fact, we've had people react to the videos of Bang Bang Con that are available on the web saying, this audience sounds way too happy. They're laughing way too much. Are they drunk? Is this, how can this be? How can people be expressing this much enthusiasm at a programming conference? And I think that one thing that makes Bang Bang Con special is that we try to create an environment in which it is safe to be as enthusiastic as you want to be. and there's no need to, act cool and jaded at BangBangCon. And that's good, because the kinds of things that you will see are absolutely stunning. We had a talk this year from Sina Bahram, who's a blind hacker, and he showed us how he interacted with JAWS, his screen reader, at I don't remember how fast it was, but it was way faster than the average person can hear. That he was listening to his screen reader, coding this way. He was listening to music while he was doing this, and it was an absolutely stunning demonstration of what he's capable of and what the technology is capable of. And I said a second ago that there were talks that made people scream "Holy shit!" I was the person screaming "Holy shit!" while this was going on, because it was so absolutely stunning. And that's, I think, typical for BangBangCon. We've had talks, from people who've, built their own cell phone. That was Kevin Leinig's talk last year. We had a tremendous keynote from Mary Rose Cook, which was about Git and the internals of Git. And this was last year. And she talked about things that were, the people in the audience just found jaw-dropping. And at BangBangCon, it is safe to say, whoa, it is safe to be impressed by these things and to be excited by these things, without worrying that anybody's going to say, oh, you didn't know about that, or make you feel as though you're inferior for being impressed. So that's, I think, what makes this conference special. One of the many things that make it special.
Cool. Yeah, this is really awesome launching off point. And I would actually argue that you do have this sort of enthusiasm and things. And maybe it was from organizing all these years and influence, or maybe you're always like that and such. Yeah. So I guess we can talk a little bit about the nuts and bolts of this, because it started off as nothing, and this requires resources and money and people and stuff. So I mean, I don't want to turn this into a giant logistics discussion, but just even briefly, how does this get off the ground?
Yeah, well, I'm glad you asked. So I think we started small. We started in 2014, and I mentioned that the people involved were from the Ricoeur Center. In fact, all of the organizers from the beginning have been somehow involved with RC. And because of that, we were able to use the RC venue, or the RC space as our venue the first year. And that was a huge boon to us right from the beginning, because it meant that we didn't have to try to find space to rent out for a weekend in New York. So that was one thing. Also, the conference is pretty small, or was pretty small. It was only 100 people. It's only one weekend long. It's a single track. And it was just entirely a volunteer effort. We were at that point, because it was the first time any of us had organized a conference, we didn't really have any expectations, like we didn't, we were every time something succeeded, we were so glad that it succeeded that, every time we, for example, when we asked our keynote speakers to participate the first year, we didn't think they were going to say yes. And they did. So we were so happy that anything worked at all, that we were kind of able to ignore the rough edges, of which there were many.
Yeah, and I think that's great. Like this sort of I love hearing about the early days of these efforts, right? That everything has to start from nothing. So like whether it's an open source project, or a community, or an online community, or a real life community, or a conference, or things, they all have to start somewhere. And then in the future, if something becomes really big, the original people remember those early days where it was, like you said, rough around the edges, and things are not perfect. But there was a visceral term about that. This word visceral, right? There is a term about that.
Yeah. And I think that probably, my favorite example of something that has gone wrong was the second year when we were planning to return to the Recurse Center for our second year, which was May 2015. And we found out about 2 weeks before. I want to say it was only 2 weeks before, maybe it was more like 3 weeks or a month. But anyway, it was a very short time. We learned that we would not be able to hold our conference at the Recurse Center because their landlord was coming down hard on them about fire code violations. So we had to find another venue on extremely short notice. And this is where Sonali Sridhar from the Recurse Center, who's one of the founders of it, this is where she really went above and beyond and pulled a bunch of strings that she has in New York and was able to get another venue for us for free on almost no notice, which was at NYU. And so we had to change the venue of our conference at the last minute. We felt terrible about it because, for one thing, we were really throwing a wrench in the plans of, some of our attendees and speakers, especially people who had, were taking public transit or had to, change their plans drastically in some way in order to get to the new venue. It ended up working out in the end, but that's one of those things that it's the sort of thing that probably could only have been done because we were such a small conference and because it was only 2 days long, because it was only 100 people. This year we actually expanded the conference because the demand for it was so great the first 2 years that we realized we really need to serve a larger audience. So this year we expanded to 200 people. And for this, there really was no free space available that could accommodate us, that we could find. So this year we ended up paying for a venue. And that ended up being the right choice because the venue was really good, but it was also just a lot of money. And it meant that our balance sheet looked very different this year than it did the first 2 years. So now that we know that, we can be prepared for it next year. And at least one person has already stepped up to maybe kind of sort of volunteer their space as a possible venue for next year, which might actually fit all of us, which we're excited about. But that's the kind of thing that we have to deal with because we're doing this on a budget and as volunteers, we don't have, there's nobody else who we can turn to take care of those kinds of logistics. It's all us.
Right. No, that's really cool because it's like if one of you doesn't handle it, it just doesn't get done, right? There's like a distinct possibility that there's some glaring part that doesn't get done, and there's no backup for that.
Yeah, and I guess one point that I want to make along those lines is that one of the most crucial things I think that I've found to be true with organizing Bang Bang Con is that trusting my fellow organizers is really crucially important because none of us can do it all ourselves, and we have to rely on each other to be able to get it done. And if somebody else is going to do it in a way that's slightly different from the way that I would do it, I have to decide, okay, well, are they going to do it in a wrong, slightly different sort of way, or are they just going to do it in a different, slightly different sort of way? And if the answer is no, it won't be wrong, it'll just be different, then I have to be okay with that. I have to trust them. And something that I have tried to do over the last 3 years of organizing it is say, I trust you pretty often. And I've noticed over time that when we first started organizing this thing, we used to be really tentative about decisions and nobody would ever do anything unless they got confirmation from the other 5 people, or at least they got a quorum of those people. Whereas this year, it's been like somebody sees something that they think needs to be done, and they're probably right because we all have enough experience with it now. We all have kind of a sense about what needs to be done. And they just go ahead and do it or find a way to cause it to get done. And that's been essential. It's been this it's definitely, you know, at this point, we're a team of people who've, you know, encountered a lot of problems with organizing Bang Bang Con. We know about, you know, all the good and the bad things that can happen. I'm sure, you know, more good and bad things that we haven't encountered are going to get thrown at us, you know, in the years to come. But at this point, you know, we have a pretty decent idea about how to organize this conference, and we trust each other, and trust is really important to being able to pull it off.
Yeah, that's huge. I mean, this is like what you said is such a general thing too, right? Of, you know, how do you work in teams in general, but, you know, more specifically here in distributed teams where people are doing this as a volunteer. I mean, this is a distributed voluntary team, and you can't all do everything all the time because you all have other jobs to do and other things in life. So, you know, even that dynamic itself is really rare too. I mean, that's what this experience is, what a lot of people want, but it's hard to get because not everyone has the opportunity to organize such a thing or be involved in a project and such. So, you know, what do you think about the kind of time commitment that's required of you and the other folks? Because you all have full-time jobs doing other stuff, I assume. And how does that balance?
You know, I don't have an exact number for you. Because it kind of blends together with other things that I do. I can say that in the day or so leading up for when I left to go to the conference last year, I was technically supposed to be working at my job, but all I could really do was think about Bang Bang Con. And that is probably true of many of the other organizers as well. I think we do a pretty decent job of spreading out the work among us. You mentioned that it was a distributed team, and that's true. In fact, this year, so the conference is in New York every year, and this year we only had 2 organizers who were actually physically in New York, Danielle Sucher and Nabil Hussain, and it was really, really crucial that they were there. Nabil and Danielle were the people who found our venue for us, which is really something that could not be done remotely. And so that's, you know, despite the fact that a lot of conference organization can be done online from wherever, there are things that you really do have to be there for. And so, and that's something that's kind of gotten more challenging over time because there were people on the organizing team who used to live in New York and have moved away. So that's kind of part of the reason why Nabil and Danielle joined the group, because we really needed boots on the ground in New York to make it possible. But it's hard, and time zone issues are hard, and we have to do a lot of hangouts like this. And I missed one of our hangouts this spring because of I was disorganized. Other people sometimes missed things, and it's you have to be willing to forgive each other for those kinds of screw ups.
Yeah, this is really interesting. I guess the next question I have that made me think of is, I want you to kind of discuss a bit about how you feel like this whole experience kind of fits into your kind of professional identity, right? So for example, some people have a job doing X and then their hobby thing is doing Y, and they're completely unrelated, right? You're like organizing motocross, dirt bike races or whatever. That's if you're passionate about equally, but it's completely unrelated to your job. But this perhaps can be a bit more tied in with your professional identity, even though obviously it's not exactly what you're doing at work every day. How do you imagine all this kind of synchronizing in your head?
Sure. Oh, that's a terrific question. So when we ran the first one, I was still in grad school, and I told my colleagues about it. I told my advisor about it, and my advisor liked it. He thought it was pretty cool. My colleagues now know about it also, and they know that I take a day off every spring to go to New York and do it. And I think that, I don't aside from the fact that I definitely don't make any secret of my participation in Bang Bang Con, and I tell people about it, but I guess it doesn't really play into my work life or my research life all that much. That said, at the event itself, I have terrific research conversations sometimes, and I think that part of that is because of the kind of people who go to Bang Bang Con, but another part of it is just the atmosphere of Bang Bang Con, as well as the Recurse Center in general, as is an atmosphere of people who are deeply curious and who they want to know about whatever cool thing that I might be working on. Thus far, I've never given a talk at Bang Bang Con. I've been a little preoccupied with organizing it. But I would love to attempt to give a research talk at Bang Bang Con. We had a great talk this year in 2016 from Laura Lindsey, who's a geophysics PhD student. And she talked about convolutions and Fourier transforms and tried to explain them visually in her talk, and explained how they how that related to her research, which has to do with she works on analyzing ice penetrating radar data from Antarctica. So I thought her talk was fascinating. We've had a few other talks from researchers over the years too. We had another one this year who's from quantum computing researcher. Those are the two examples that I have that come to top of mind. Laura Lindsey and the one on quantum computing, which was from Jennifer Furnick from the University of Waterloo.
Cool. Yeah, I'll pull both of those up in the notes, because afterwards I'll put all the links up. Yeah, I mean, one thing I was thinking about along these lines is that these sorts of this environment of intellectual curiosity, like you're mentioning, and the visceral sort of excitement, like that is, I think, especially for people like us who are working in cutting edge research and advancing field and stuff intellectually, having that, keeping that spark alive inside of our heads, I think is really important, even if it's something that's not directly related to the exact problem you're working on at work. I think there's something big to be said about inspiration and enthusiasm and all the stuff that we're talking about here.
Right, yeah. And I have mixed feelings here, I have to say, because one of the reasons why I like hanging out with researchers and being a researcher and going to research conferences is that I actually appreciate the fact that people are not relentlessly enthusiastic all the time. If I wanted to hear about how everything was the greatest thing ever all the time, then I could go to industry conferences and I could get that. But my view about at research conferences, instead, what we talk about is what's hard and what we're struggling with, and or at least for me, my favorite parts of research are hearing people talk about what they're struggling with and what they're just barely beginning to figure out. And I think there's a certain kind of respect for hard problems that researchers have. You don't hear researchers say, "Oh, well, why don't you just do this?" So often, because everybody knows that everybody is wrestling with something that's hard.
Yeah, that's actually really good. Let's actually talk about this more, because this is a good term. Yeah, so kind of contrasting what you feel is valuable about more academic sort of conferences versus the Bang Bang Con end of things. I think it'll be really awesome.
Sure. Well, I think Bang Bang Con is kind of in a different place. So there are industry conferences where which may even be, say, sponsored by a company, and they tend to attract talks where people are really excited about that company's product, and in the worst case, the talk is practically a product pitch.
Well, yeah, I mean, their role is called developer evangelist, right? They are called developer evangelists.
Right. Sure. Yeah.
They're very
right.
explicit about that sort of evangelism. But yeah.
Right. Yeah. And then and Bang Bang Con really tries very hard not to be that. I'm involved with the talk proposal review for Bang Bang Con, which, by the way, one of the things about Bang Bang Con that I think is especially cool is that we do anonymous talk proposal review. So when you submit your talk proposal, we don't know who it's from. And in fact, we go to an effort to remove identifying information from what you submit so that we can try to review it in a way that's as bias-free as we can make it. But one of the things that I downgrade a given talk proposal for is if it sounds too much like a pitch for a certain product. And so I'm much more interested in talks that are, not about any particular product or service, or, sometimes the talk won't be, about a particular product or service as such, but it'll nevertheless be about something that someone is demonstrating that really can't be replicated unless you have some particular service that you've paid for, or software that you've paid for. And I don't really care for those either. I can't speak for the other organizers because we kind of all have different taste. And if any one of us were creating the program for Bang Bang Con, it would probably look different than the program that we actually end up coming up with. But I try to focus more on a different kind of talk. I try to focus again on the ones that are, again, that visceral experience of computing. And I think you can go to the Bang Bang Con website to see the kind of things that we end up with. It's a stunningly broad variety of different kinds of talks, and they're really all over the map. They're everything from people talking about wacky OS internals to code running on spacecraft to quantum computing to color theory and how that plays out in software. Weird text manipulation and poetry stuff. It's really all over the map, and that's part of what makes Bang Bang Con so great.
Interesting. And how broad do you think? I mean, I guess in the last few minutes thinking about how broad would you want to, so both scale-wise, right, in terms of the number of people involved, and also topics-wise, how broad, how much do you want to keep it at its core, at status quo, versus the pressure to grow more broad or bigger? And what do you see in the coming years?
Oh, it's a really hard question. We struggled with that, actually, in terms of size of the conference, going from 2015 to 2016. We were a little bit worried about expanding the conference from even just from 100 to 200 people, because we were worried that it would change the flavor of Bang Bang Con and it wouldn't be as cool or as unique of an event. And I'm happy to say that I don't think that happened. In fact, I think 2016 was our best year yet, and I think this year we really raised the bar for how we wanted the conference to be. In terms of the breadth of the event, that's something that I've been thinking about too. Right now, our tagline is the joy, excitement, and surprise of programming. But some of our talks don't necessarily have that much to do with programming as such. They have a lot to do with computing. So for example, we had a talk this year, or we had several talks this year that were really, maybe more about math or, quantum computing, or, something that was computational, but wasn't necessarily about code. And I think that that's okay. But I think that if that is the direction that we're going to go, then I think that we might want to reconsider this joy, excitement, and surprise of programming tagline and think about, should we replace the word programming with computing?
Right.
Or, should we keep it because we seem to be having good luck with that so far because we're attracting the kind of speakers that we want to attract. So, so that's something that we're going to have to continually re-examine.
Cool. So I guess on a parting thought, if you can stare into the crystal ball in the future, and however many years you want to predict in the future, or however ambitious you want to predict, what do you think is the the future in years for BangBangCon?
Well, I hope that it continues. We bought the domain name for 5 years, so I hope that it goes for at least 5 years. Whether I personally stay involved, I think it would actually be a victory for me to stop being involved and for BangBangCon to continue and get better, without me. I don't know what to say. I mean, every year it seemed, at least for the first couple of years, it seemed like it was a victory just to be able to have the conference at all. And it's possible that in 2016 we finally got past that point where just having the conference at all was a victory, and now we can kind of begin to refine the conference and figure out, now that the conference itself has proven to be a success, now we can talk about, what do we really want this conference to be. And we've been very lucky in that we've had an absolutely astonishing, tremendous outpouring of support from people. We've had people who said, this is the coolest conference I've been to. Somebody literally said, Ashley Bloor literally said, best conference ever, filled entirely with perfect people, which sounds like I'm lying, but that's actually what she said. And this year somebody said, if I never went to another tech conference again, this would be the one to have ended on. So it's great to get all this praise, but I don't think we should rest on our laurels. I think we have to keep working, and there are already things that I feel like we can improve from last year to this year. So, I can't predict the future, but I can tell you what I hope would happen, which is that we continue to improve and evolve.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Lindsey. This is an awesome conversation. We'll head offline. Thanks, Lindsey.